She buried his uniform, wept at his empty grave, and spent 5 decades whispering, "I miss you," into the wind. But then one ordinary afternoon, a letter arrived, signed in handwriting she hadn't seen since 1971, and suddenly everything she thought she knew was shattered. This isn't just a love story. It's a mystery, a war, a secret kept for half a century. And it begins with a woman named Margaret, and the man the world thought was dead. Margaret Hale had lived in the same small white cottage for more than 60 years. Her neighbors knew her as the sweet old lady with silver curls and a rose garden that won town awards. But behind her warm smile was a sadness that never faded. Her husband Daniel had gone missing in action during the Vietnam War in 1971. They said he was likely killed during a firefight near the Cambodian border. No body, no dog tags, just a report, a flag, and silence. At only 26, Margaret became a widow without a grave. She held a memorial, placed his folded uniform in a glass box above the fireplace, wrote in her journal every night, as if she were still writing to him. "I made chicken and rice again today," she once wrote. You always asked for seconds. Life moved on around her. Friends remarried. Families grew. Margaret taught at the elementary school for 30 years, then retired quietly. But she never moved, never changed the wallpaper, never took down their wedding photo from the hallway. Once in a lifetime, she would say, touching the frame, "And once is enough for me." Then, on a Tuesday morning in early spring, just as Margaret was pruning the hydrangeas, her doorbell rang. She opened the door to find a young postal worker holding out a stiff, yellowed envelope. It had no return address. The postmark Vietnam. Margaret blinked. "Excuse me, is this a mistake?" "No, ma'am," the young man said. "It's registered to you. Signature required." Her hand trembled as she scribbled her name on the pad. She stood there in her doorway for several minutes, staring at the envelope, like it was something alive. It felt wrong. It felt impossible, but there it was, 52 years after she said goodbye. A letter from Vietnam. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, creased and faded. The handwriting was unmistakable. She hadn't seen it in half a century, but she knew. It was Daniel's. "My dearest Margaret, if this letter has somehow reached you, it means the unimaginable has happened. I am alive." Margaret dropped into her armchair, breathless. Her chest tightened and tears clouded her eyes. Was it a prank? Some cruel mistake? But the signature at the bottom, the way he curled the G in her name, it was all him. "I've waited a long time to write this. I didn't know if I ever could. But now, I have to try." Margaret clutched the page, unsure whether she was dreaming or losing her mind. She sat there, sunlight falling across the letter, and whispered, "Daniel." As the day turned into night, Margaret read the letter over and over again. Each word chipped away at the years of grief and confusion. Daniel was alive, or at least he had been, when the letter was written. There was no date, no instructions, no phone number, just his words, raw and haunting. "I've been in hiding, Margaret, not by choice. I need you to know everything. If you want the truth, come to Saigon." Her heart stopped. Saigon. He was asking her to come back to the place where he vanished. She hadn't set foot on a plane in decades. She was 78 years old. And yet, she stood up slowly and walked to the hallway, eyes fixed on the wedding photo. "Looks like I'm not done with you yet," she whispered. The letter wouldn't let her sleep. All night, Margaret lay awake, with Daniel's words echoing in her mind. "I've been in hiding, not by choice. If you want the truth, come to Saigon." She kept the letter folded under her pillow, as if it might vanish by morning. By sunrise, Margaret had made her decision. She would go. Not for answers, not even for closure. For him. If Daniel had somehow survived, if he was truly alive, then nothing else mattered. Not her age, not her fears. She reached into the drawer, where she'd kept her passport, expired for nearly 20 years. The picture barely looked like her anymore. But that wasn't going to stop her. Her first stop was the travel office on Main Street. The young woman behind the counter blinked in surprise when Margaret explained what she needed. "Vietnam, ma'am." "Are you sure?" "I'm not sure about anything," Margaret replied, steady. "Except that I need to be there." 3 days later, after a whirlwind of paperwork, vaccinations, and one very long visit to the passport agency, she boarded a plane for the first time in over 3 decades. With trembling fingers, she held a single photograph in her lap. The whole way, a black and white picture of her and Daniel on their wedding day. He was in uniform. She wore lace gloves. He looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that made sense. Now, here she was, flying back to the place that had taken him away. When the plane landed in Ho Chi Minh City, what was once Saigon, the heat hit her like a wave. Heavy, dense, unforgiving. Margaret stepped into the bustling terminal, where the noise and energy of the city surged all around her. So much had changed: neon signs, traffic buzzing, shops with colorful banners. But the air still carried something familiar, something distant. She checked into a small, quiet guest house at the edge of the city, run by a kind older woman who spoke fluent English and served ginger tea without asking. That night, Margaret sat on the balcony staring at the letter again. One phrase stood out: "Ask for the man called Tuan at the Eden Cafe. He knows everything." The next morning, Margaret took a cab through the narrow, winding streets, her heart pounding harder with each passing block. She clutched the letter tightly, like it could protect her. The Eden Cafe was tucked beneath a row of hanging lanterns and creeping vines, nestled between 2 art galleries. Its walls were covered in framed photos, war era, Saigon protest marches, smiling children with military boots too big for their feet. She stepped inside. A thin man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses stood behind the counter wiping mugs. "Tuan?" she asked. He looked up sharply. "Yes." She held out the letter. "I was told to find you." He studied her for a long time, too long. Then he whispered something in Vietnamese to a young server and motioned for Margaret to follow him to a back room. She hesitated, then stepped through the doorway. The room was silent, except for the ticking of a clock. Shelves lined the walls, books, old radios, a faded helmet with the initials DOHC scratched into the side. She froze. Her hands trembled. Daniel H. Carter. Tuan sat down and sighed. "So, you're his wife." Margaret nodded slowly. "Where is he?" Tuan closed his eyes, as if weighing how much truth to release. "He is alive, but he is hidden." Margaret leaned forward. Why didn't he come home?" Tuan opened a drawer and pulled out a file, one that looked decades old, with yellowed edges and a red stamp across the front. "Classified. He was captured in 1971, Tuan said. "Presumed dead by the U.S. military. But he wasn't. He escaped in 1973 and was found by locals injured and confused. He didn't remember who he was for a long time. When he finally did, he was afraid to return." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Afraid?" Tuan nodded. "He believed he was listed as dead. He feared he'd be arrested, or worse, forgotten. He thought you had moved on." Margaret reached for the armrest to steady herself. "I never stopped waiting." Tuan handed her another envelope. Inside was a photo, color grainy but unmistakable. Daniel, older, beard, thinner. But those eyes, she knew those eyes. "I need to see him," she whispered. Tuan hesitated. "He lives in a rural village, off the grid. I can take you, but it's not easy." Margaret didn't blink. "Then, we'd better leave in the morning." That night she couldn't sleep, not because she was afraid, but because hope, after so many years, felt heavier than grief. She sat by the window as the city pulsed below her. If the letter was real, if Daniel was alive, what would she say? Would he even remember her? At dawn, the city still slept under a blanket of fog. Margaret waited outside the cafe, with a small bag slung over her shoulder. Tuan pulled up in a dusty, dented Jeep, its paint faded and its engine coughing awake with a shudder. "You're really doing this?" he asked, eyeing the 78-year-old woman, standing like a soldier at roll call. "I didn't come all this way to turn back." "Now," she replied. And with that, they rumbled out of the city past rows of street vendors, just setting up for the day, past scooters weaving between carts, past the modern world, slowly dissolving into fields and dirt roads. The ride took hours. The paved highways gave way to gravel paths, then to muddy lanes, flanked by rice paddies and children who stopped to wave at the strange visitors. Margaret barely spoke. She stared out the window, watching the country roll past, like scenes from a dream she didn't know she still remembered. Tuan finally broke the silence. "He talks about you." Margaret turned slowly. "What does he say? That you were stronger than he ever was? That your love kept him alive, long after he thought he had nothing left to live for?" Margaret swallowed hard. "Then why didn't he come home?" Tuan didn't answer right away. He focused on the road. Some men carry wounds where no bandage can reach. He believed showing up after 50 years would break you. He didn't want to bring more pain. Margaret looked down at her hands, but the pain was in the silence. They arrived at the village just as the sky turned golden. It wasn't much, a handful of homes, all wooden and sun-worn, with chickens darting between the stilts and smoke curling up from cook fires. Tuan parked near a shaded path and motioned toward the trees. "He lives just beyond that bend," he said, "alone. But the villagers bring him food, medicine." Margaret stepped out of the Jeep slowly, her knees stiff, but her resolve strong. Every step felt like walking through time. She followed the path, the birds quieting overhead, until she saw it, a small thatched roof house, and a man seated outside facing the field, a straw hat pulled low over his eyes. He was carving something delicate, focused. Her voice trembled. As she called out, "Daniel," the man stiffened. The knife in his hand froze mid-stroke. He turned slowly, and for a moment time stopped. They stared at each other, 50 years of longing, condensed into a single stunned breath. He stood, and Margaret gasped. It was him. Older, yes, weathered, a bit thinner. But it was him. Daniel's eyes filled with tears, and his voice cracked like old vinyl. "Margaret," she nodded, her lips trembling. "I got your letter." He took a hesitant step forward, then another, until they stood inches apart. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "I was," he said. "Until now." He reached out and took her hand, rough, calloused, but warm. They stood there, silent, tears falling, the weight of 5 decades pressing in on both sides. No words could fill that void, but touch could. He motioned for her to sit, and she lowered herself onto the wooden step beside him. He poured her tea, his hands shaking. "I don't know what to say," he said softly. Margaret chuckled through the tears. "Start at the beginning." And so he did. He told her everything. The ambush, the explosion, waking up in a jungle hut with half his memory gone, the months he spent as a ghost in a land he couldn't understand. He told her about regaining fragments of his past, her smile, their wedding song, her favorite flower, and the fear that he had missed his chance to come home. "I thought maybe you'd moved on," he said, ashamed. "Married again, had a whole new life." Margaret laughed gently. "You always thought too little of me." "I thought too much of you," he replied. "That's why I stayed away. I couldn't bear the idea of being a shadow of who I used to be." Margaret reached for his hand again. "You were never a shadow. You were my light." As night fell over, the village lanterns flickered to life. Tuan stood at a distance, watching quietly as two souls long torn apart by war, fate, and fear sat side by side on a porch in Vietnam, rediscovering the sound of each other's voice. And in that still, humid air, after 50 years of silence, the conversation finally began. The next morning, the roosters crowed before the sun rose, but Margaret was already awake. She hadn't slept much. How could she? Daniel Carter, her Daniel, was alive just a few feet away, sleeping under a roof made of palm leaves and thyme. She had spent over 50 years whispering to a ghost, and now that ghost had a heartbeat. She stepped outside, into the humid morning, the scent of wood smoke and rice drifting through the air. Daniel was already up boiling water in a small kettle, his posture the same as it had been back in the cottage kitchen. Decades ago. You still wake up before the sun, she said softly. He turned, smiled gently. Old habits don't die, even if you do. Over the next few days, Margaret began to see the life Daniel had lived since he disappeared. It was simple, quiet, honest. The villagers called him Ong Dan, which meant Old Mr. Dan. Children brought him baskets of fruit. Young men helped him carry water. He fixed shoes, mended fishing nets, and carved toys from driftwood. There were no phones, no photographs on the walls, just stacks of notebooks, most filled with sketches, faces he couldn't remember clearly, but couldn't bear to forget. One sketch, however, was unmistakable. A woman in a 1960s sundress, standing in front of a rose bush. Margaret stared at it for a long time, before whispering, "You drew me." Daniel looked away. "I drew you every year, on our anniversary. I couldn't remember your exact face after a while, but the feeling, that stayed." That evening, as the village lit their lanterns and cooked dinner over open flames, Margaret and Daniel sat beside each other on the porch again. "Did you ever try to contact the embassy?" she asked. "I did. Once," he said, his voice low. "About 10 years after the war ended. I was too late. They told me my death had been certified. My name was etched in stone on a memorial back home." Margaret nodded. "I visited that stone every year. I didn't want to rip open old wounds," Daniel said. "You were probably happy." "I told myself that every time I wanted to write. I wasn't happy," she said without anger. "Just truth. I survived. But I was never whole." Daniel didn't speak. He just reached into a box beside his chair and pulled out something wrapped in silk. A necklace. Her necklace. The one she gave him the night before he left for Vietnam. "You kept this," she said, voice cracking. "I never took it off. Until I thought it might break," he said. "It reminded me that you were waiting." Margaret held it gently, the cool metal warming in her palm. "I never stopped," she whispered. The next morning, Tuan returned to check in. Margaret pulled him aside while Daniel was gathering firewood. "Why did he finally send the letter?" she asked. Tuan hesitated. "A year ago he got sick. Fever. Delirious. He thought it was the end. I stayed with him. And during one night, he kept calling your name." She felt a lump rise in her throat. Tuan continued. "When he recovered, I asked him who you were. That's when he told me everything. And finally, he said, if she's still out there, I want her to know." Margaret turned to look at Daniel in the distance, bent under a bundle of wood. "He didn't want to die with a secret," she murmured. "No," Tuan said. "He wanted to live with the truth, even if it was too late." But was it too late? That question followed Margaret everywhere: in the garden, where Daniel grew lemongrass, in the little kitchen where they cooked together, like they used to, even in the silence between words, when they just were. Could two people simply continue after 5 decades apart? Could love survive the silence? Daniel seemed unsure too. One night he asked, "What happens when you go back home?" Margaret looked up at him, eyes tired but calm. "I don't know yet." He nodded slowly, staring into the fire. "I wouldn't blame you if you stayed gone again." She reached out and took his hand. "I didn't cross the ocean to walk away." He looked at her with a mixture of awe and regret. "You're braver than I ever was." "No," she said, squeezing his fingers. "I was just waiting." That night, as the stars blinked above the jungle, Daniel wrote a letter, not to Margaret, but to someone else, to the U.S. government, to the past, to the world. It was time to stop hiding. 3 days after Daniel mailed his letter to the U.S. Embassy in Hanoi, everything changed. Until then, Margaret and Daniel had lived in a bubble, fragile but beautiful, cooking together, laughing softly, rediscovering one another in the quiet spaces between regret and hope. But when the letter reached American hands, the bubble popped. It started with a phone call to Margaret's old landline back home in the States. Her neighbor Carol left a message in a shaky voice. "Margaret, honey, the State Department just called me. They say Daniel's alive. The news is already spreading. The Pentagon wants confirmation. They think it's some kind of fraud or miracle. Please call me when you get this." Back in the village, Margaret listened to the voicemail twice before handing the phone to Daniel. He sat quietly, then chuckled under his breath. "Well, I guess the cat's out of the bag." But it wasn't just a cat. It was a storm. 2 days later, a black SUV pulled into the village. An American diplomat stepped out, flanked by 2 local officials and a translator. They greeted Daniel with stiff formality, as if unsure whether to salute or cry. "Mr. Carter," the diplomat said, extending a hand. "We've been looking for you for a very long time." Daniel looked down at the man's hand, then slowly shook it. "I wasn't hiding from you. I was hiding from myself." They sat down in Daniel's modest home. Margaret stayed beside him the entire time, her hand resting gently on his knee as they told their story. The escape, the memory loss, the long silence, the recent reunion. The diplomat asked questions, took notes, recorded everything. Then he made a quiet request. "Sir, we'd like to bring you home." That night, Daniel sat on the porch with Margaret, watching fireflies dance across the field. "I don't know what home even means anymore," he said. "America is a place I remember through newspapers and black and white photographs. Here, this is what I know." Margaret nodded. "But it's not just about you anymore." He turned toward her. "They buried an empty coffin with your name on it. Families, soldiers, friends, everyone believed you died a hero. Don't you think it's time to show them you lived one?" Daniel looked away. "What if I can't be who they need me to be?" Margaret smiled softly. "You don't have to be anything but honest. That's what they need. That's what you never stopped being." Within a week, the story broke. Missing Vietnam. War soldier found alive in rural Vietnam. It spread like wildfire. Newspapers, talk shows, online headlines. Social media lit up with theories, questions, and awe. Everyone had something to say about Daniel Carter, the man who returned from the dead. Back in Hartsville, the town where Margaret had lived all her life, a memorial plaque that bore Daniel's name was suddenly the focus of national attention. People left flowers at it again, this time not for mourning, but for celebration. Veterans began writing letters to the local paper. He didn't just survive. He carried all of us who didn't. Daniel Carter's story proves that some wars don't end on the battlefield. Margaret's mailbox back home overflowed with cards, candles, even framed photos of people saluting his name. The U.S. government prepared for his official return. They planned a ceremony, a hero's welcome, even offered Daniel full military honors and a chance to speak at the National Veterans Memorial. But Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure he deserved it. "I didn't fight to be a symbol," he said. "I just tried to stay alive." Margaret touched his hand. "But now your survival means something, not just to me, to so many others." The final decision came when Daniel received a letter from a stranger, a 25-year-old soldier who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. The letter read, "I was going to give up. Then I read your story. You made me believe there's a way back even after being lost. Thank you, sir. Welcome home." Daniel read it once, then again. Then he folded the paper and said quietly, "All right, I'll go." The embassy arranged the flight. Margaret and Daniel stood together at the village edge, As the sun rose, bags packed ready to leave the jungle behind. The villagers gathered to say goodbye, tears in their eyes, hands pressed together in respect. Children ran after the jeep as it pulled away, shouting goodbye, Ong Dan. Come back. Daniel smiled, tears welling in his eyes. I might not belong anywhere, he whispered to Margaret, but I've never felt more seen. She squeezed his hand. You're not just seen, Daniel. You're remembered. The plane touched down at Dulles International Airport under a gray sky 52 years after Daniel Carter's name was etched onto the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Margaret looked over. As the plane taxied to the gate, he was staring out the window, gripping the armrest, his jaw tight. You okay? She asked gently. Daniel didn't answer at first. Then, in a low voice, it's strange, coming home to a place you're not sure is yours anymore. Margaret rested her hand over his. It's your home, Daniel. It always was, even when you weren't here. They were greeted not by flashing cameras or fanfare, but by a quiet group of officials and veterans, standing with folded hands, solemn expressions, and teary eyes. A younger officer stepped forward. Sir, welcome home, he said, voice thick with emotion. You've been gone a long time, but we never forgot you. Daniel nodded slowly. I forgot myself for a while. I'm just starting to remember. Margaret watched as one man after another saluted him, not out of protocol, out of respect, out of awe. The next few days were a blur. Medical checkups, government interviews, quiet visits from journalists who asked questions Daniel wasn't always ready to answer. Some stories he shared, some he left buried in the jungle. One night, a representative from the Department of Defense placed a crisp folder in his hands. These are your records updated. You're no longer MIA. Your service has been reinstated with full honors. Daniel opened the folder. There it was. His name, not followed by a cross, not labeled presumed deceased. Just Daniel Carter, United States Army, retired. He didn't say a word. He just closed the folder and looked out the window again. A few days later, Margaret took him to see something he hadn't asked for, but needed. The memorial. It was quiet that morning. Only a handful of visitors wandered the black granite wall, fingers trailing the engraved names. Daniel stood still, staring at panel 17E. There it was. Carter D.H. Margaret stepped beside him. I came here every year. Left flowers, sometimes letters. Daniel's eyes didn't leave the gnome. Feels strange? Looking at your own tombstone. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a white rose, then gently laid it at the base of the wall. To the man I was, he whispered, and to all the ones who didn't get to come back. After that visit, Daniel changed. Something settled in him, like the ghost that had haunted him for so long had finally been laid to rest. Back in Hartsville, news of Daniel's return had spread quickly. The little town Margaret never left was suddenly the focus of national attention. The town council planned a welcome ceremony at the community center. Veterans lined the sidewalks. Boy Scouts waved flags. Neighbors, many of them children when Daniel left, gathered in disbelief. Daniel stood before a microphone with Margaret by his side. He didn't speak from paper. He spoke from his soul. I didn't come back expecting applause, he said, or headlines, or banners. I came back because someone never gave up on me. Not in a war. Not in silence. Not in 50 years of waiting. He turned to Margaret, his voice catching. She believed I was still out there. And because of her, I found myself again. The crowd stood, applauded, cried. That night in the house, Margaret had never left. Daniel walked through the hallway for the first time since 1971. The wallpaper was the same. So was the wedding photo. He paused in front of it and smiled. I used to wonder what we'd look like now. Margaret laughed softly. Older, grayer, but still us. They stood there in silence, hands intertwined. Later, Daniel opened a small trunk in the corner of the room, his old army footlocker. Inside, Was everything Margaret had saved: his letters, his uniform, even the book of poems he once read to her before bed. He picked it up and turned to a dog-eared page. Then he began to read. Though time may silence voices and dim the glow of youth, love once lit does not forget the truth. Margaret leaned on his shoulder, and for the first time in over 50 years, they both felt truly home. Weeks passed. Autumn settled over Hartsville, painting the leaves gold and red. Life began to slow down again, but not quite like before, because this time, Daniel was here. Margaret would find him in the backyard most mornings, tending the rose bushes she once planted alone. He said it helped clear his mind. Healing's not a straight path, he told her one day, but at least now I'm walking it. What neither of them expected was the ripple effect of Daniel's return. A local high school history teacher reached out. I want my students to hear your story, he said. Your living history. Daniel was hesitant at first. I'm no teacher, he replied, but Margaret nudged him. You've taught me everything about strength, just by surviving. Now teach them. So he agreed. In a packed classroom, 11th graders sat in silence as Daniel stood at the front. No slideshow, no notes, just one man weathered by war, humbled by time, speaking from the heart. I wasn't a hero, he began. I was scared most of the time, but I showed up. I did what I could, and I held on to hope even when I didn't know I was. He talked about the jungle, the confusion, the loneliness, but then he talked about Margaret, about a letter found half a century later, and the moment everything changed. When he finished, the students stood and clapped. Some cried. One boy lingered after the bell rang. My grandpa served too, he said. He never talks about it, but maybe now he will. Daniel placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Tell him I'd like to talk with him. Vet to vet. Soon, invitations poured in. Veteran centers, church groups, TV interviews, even a documentary team from PBS asked to film his story. Daniel agreed to most, but only if Margaret was beside him. This happened because of her, he always said. She's the reason I was found. Margaret would smile, shake her head, and quietly remind him I was just stubborn. Then one day a letter arrived, with a Department of Defense seal. Daniel opened it at the kitchen table, reading it twice, before sliding it over to Margaret. She gasped. They were offering him the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the nation's highest civilian honors, for extraordinary service, sacrifice, and enduring strength, not just for surviving, but for inspiring. Daniel stared at the letter, stunned. I didn't do anything extraordinary, he whispered. Yes, Margaret said softly, taking his hand. You lived when you had every reason not to. The ceremony was held in Washington, D.C. It was quiet, dignified. Veterans from multiple wars filled the room: Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. As Daniel took the stage, he looked out at the crowd and saw 1,000 faces carrying the same weight he once did. He didn't speak long, just enough. I accept this not for me, he said, but for every soldier who never got to come home, and for every family who waited and waited and waited, like Margaret did. Then turning to her directly, he added, This is your medal too. They placed the gold medal around his neck, and the room rose in a standing ovation. But Daniel didn't smile for the cameras. He looked only at Margaret, the woman who believed in a ghost and brought him back to life. That night, as they walked back to their hotel, hand in hand, Daniel whispered, It feels like I've been given a second life. You have, Margaret said. And what do I do with it? She paused, looked at him under the city lights, and said, Whatever brings you peace. Winter came quietly to Hartsville. Snow dusted the rooftops and settled on the old rose garden out back, where 2 chairs sat side by side, weathered by time, but never abandoned. Inside, Daniel and Margaret sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a single quilt, a cup of tea in each hand, and no words needed between them. It had been nearly a year since the letter arrived, the letter that cracked the seal on 5 decades of silence, A year since Daniel returned from the dead, and yet to them, it all still felt like yesterday. Daniel had taken to writing again, not in notebooks this time, but letters, to soldiers he'd met on his speaking tours, to families of those still missing, to the young boy whose grandfather had finally opened up, but most importantly to himself. He wrote about the guilt that still lived in the corners of his heart, about the days in the jungle when he forgot what hope felt like, and about the moment he saw Margaret on that path and realized life doesn't end when you're lost. It begins again when someone finds you. One morning, Margaret woke to find a letter on her nightstand, the handwriting shaky but familiar. She opened it slowly. To my wife, my compass through time. I don't know how I got so lucky to be loved. This long, this patiently, this fiercely. I was afraid for so many years. Afraid you had forgotten. Afraid I didn't deserve to be remembered. But you thought that you remembered for both of us. You waited, and in doing so, you brought me back. If this is the final chapter of our story, then let it be written in peace, not in mourning, not in regret, but in gratitude, for love that lasts through silence, through time, through war, through death itself. Yours always, Daniel. Margaret folded the letter with trembling hands and tucked it inside her locket, next to the one she had worn since 1971. She didn't need anything more. The town eventually stopped talking about the headlines. Reporters faded. News cycles moved on. But Daniel Carter, a live, quiet kind, became something else. A mentor, a symbol, a neighbor who waved to kids riding bikes, a man who always showed up on Memorial Day, hand over heart, standing a little straighter each year. On the first anniversary of his return, the town unveiled a new plaque beside the war memorial. It read, Daniel H. Carter, Maya 1971, found 2023. Not every hero returns in a flag-draped coffin. Some come back quietly, held together by hope and by the love that refused to let go. Margaret stood beside him as they pulled the cloth away, her hand in his, her heart full. I used to dream you'd come back, she whispered. Daniel turned to her. And I used to dream I'd be worthy of it. That night, they sat in their old chairs watching snowfall. Margaret reached out, laced her fingers with his. Do you ever wish it had all happened differently, she asked. Daniel thought for a moment. No, he said, because then I might have never known how much one letter could change everything. Some love stories begin with a wedding, others with a goodbye. But the rarest ones begin again when all hope is lost. Daniel and Margaret's story reminds us, love can outlast war. Hope can survive silence. And one letter can bring someone back to life. If this story touched you, leave a comment below and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories that stay with you long after the credits roll. And remember, love always finds a way back.